Hi, and welcome to the webinar about leveraging decision making. So a little bit about myself. My name is Amir Kessler. I wrote here a little bit about my background. I started in the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, which is mandatory in Israel, in the cyber unit, of course. I later worked for several cybersecurity companies, most of them around mobile security, so defending against mobile application, malwares on smartphones, mobile phones, stuff like that. The last startup I worked for was acquired by Checkpoint. In Checkpoint, I worked for a while, also, of course, in cyber defense, creating and defining new defense products for different types of threats. And after Checkpoint, I joined Cover, which I'm still working at today. And at Cover, for those who don't know, what we do is financial cyber risk quantification. So what we do is help CISOs, board members, CFOs, anyone who wants to put a dollar value on their cyber risk, to understand their cyber risk in financial terms. I've been with Cover for the past 6 years, and I've talked with many CISOs and with many board members, and I can definitely see the value of cyber risk notification. Excuse me, right? So from talking with CISO, helping them understand how to better communicate their needs, how to better justify their needs to the board member. And from the other side, to board members to understand what exactly is the risk in terms that they can actually work with, and knowing how to ask from the security team for different approaches, different risk assessments that are better fit for their concerns. And I would say these two sides, right? So understanding the CISO and the board member is what led me to create this webinar. So the idea of the webinar is to, I'll stay here for one more second. The idea of the webinar is to talk about how we can do cyber risk assessment in general, even cyber risk management in general, and how we can choose in our own cyber risk assessment and cyber risk management processes to do it in a way that will be easier for board members to understand and easier to communicate. Okay, so that's kind of what we will be focusing on today. I know there's a bunch of people here. It's not our first webinar. All of us people usually say, let's not have it as a webinar, but as a conversation. It never actually happens. But I will be happy if we could try as much as we can to leverage the fact that you can ask me questions and that you can, say your thoughts and speak your thoughts and concerns while I'm talking. If anyone feels comfortable at this point already to write in the chat anything around expectations from the webinar, something you would like to hear about, something you would like me to dive into, that would be great. It will help me focus during the webinar. It will help me, make sure that I attend your questions. And if not, it's still okay. I'm just telling you that I will keep one eye on the Q&A all the time. So feel free to send it either directly or through the moderator, and I'll answer your questions. So I'll give, just a few seconds to see if there are any questions or any expectations you would like to share before I start. All right, so it seems that at this point there are no expectations or questions, so I'll just start. And if anyone would feel, that you want to ask something during the webinar, again, please feel free. So let's talk about risk management. Let's talk about what is good risk management, and this will be the framework for the rest of the talk. So let's start by asking, what is risk management? I think all of us here have experience with risk management. It's not something that is, new to any of us, but still, even after all these years, I always find it good to start with this question and have this as the base for everything else. So what we want to have with risk management is, first of all, the ability to contribute to real-time decisions before they are made, right? So risk management should be done in a point of time where we can change our plans, change the future to maybe lower our risk. We want to offer insights that no one else can. As I wrote, it doesn't take much to do plot dots and a heat map. So we want to do a risk management that is a bit more advanced than the, let's call it, naive one, or the one that is more the basic approach. And of course, we want to actually add value rather than just tick a box like we've done a risk management. So I think, these three, if we'll be actually able to do all of them, we are already pretty good compared to what I'm seeing with a lot of companies in their risk management processes. But I want to talk about the last 3 points here, and this will really be the framework for all of the talk. So if that's just risk management in general, what defines a good risk management? So I think the first thing is that we want to be able to measure the risk in a decision supporting way, right? So we want to be able, when we do risk assessments, to measure it in a way that we can actually make decisions accordingly. And we want to understand all of the risk, the entire breadth of the risk, and not just the average risk or the worst case scenario. We want to understand everything that can happen. And this means to capture the uncertainty that is involved in the decisions. So every risk will always have a lot of uncertainty. And this uncertainty will mean that it complicates to understand the risk. And I'll talk much more about all of these points, but this is just an overview. And the third thing is we want to have a risk management process that will help us make cost-effective solutions, right, for the risk mitigation, the ROI. We will never be able to completely dismiss the risk. We will never be able to completely, have no risk. But what we want to do is make sure that the projects that we choose to do and the processes we have in our company, the risk that they onboard makes sense. That what we put in the risk that we are on board is lower than what is the potential value. Now, if you take these 3 points, decision supporting and understanding the entirety of the risk and ROI, you can actually put them on 3 dimensions, right? So give me 1 second. My throat is a bit sore, so I'll be zipping tea throughout the talk, so excuse me. So if we talked about the ability to measure risk in a decision supporting way, this has to do with 1 dimension of risk management. And this dimension is, what exactly are we measuring? Are we measuring risk, or are we measuring maybe compliance to different frameworks, right? So there's this tension between the two, and our decision where to focus on will be the answer to, are we measuring the risk in a decision supporting way? In the same token, if we want to understand the entirety of the risk, we need to understand if we want to measure risk in a deterministic way or in a probabilistic way. Meaning, are we just looking at the risk and just giving it a specific impact, or are we taking into account uncertainty and understanding that there is probability involved in every risk? And again, it's a tension that we can decide where we want to put ourselves. And the last piece, the qualitative versus quantitative, helps us to understand, are we mitigating the risk in a cost-effective way? So again, it's a tension between the two. Now, these 3 dimensions are going to be, let's say, the agenda of the talk. I'm going to go one by one. I'm going to deep dive into all of them. I'm going to explain what are the differences between risk and compliance, between deterministic and probabilistic, right? And the third, of course, I'm going to explain what are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach. And I'm going to leave it as a, let's call it quite open for you to decide where you want to put yourself. And it's important to say that these 3 dimensions are independent. Someone can decide that they can, when they do risk management, they focus on risk and they do it in a probabilistic way and a qualitative way. And in the same token, you can focus on compliance in a probabilistic way and a quantitative way. So it's 3 different dimensions that, of course, are connected in a way, but you can choose where you want to be. And by the end of the talk, I will be happy if everyone here in the audience, will feel comfortable to know the differences in all 3 dimensions and also have an idea where they want to be. So let's start with the first dimension, the difference between risk and compliance in risk management. So what we're going to talk about in this section, and I'm just saying it by the way, if you're forgetting where we are and you want to know what is the context, I put the dimension we're currently talking about here at the bottom. So, right, you see it, risk versus compliance. Now it's at the bottom. This will accompany us throughout the presentation. So when we're talking about the measurement of risk, we need to ask ourselves a very basic question, which is, what are we measuring and how are we measuring it? And in order to answer that question, I want to focus on the framework of GRC, risk, compliance, and governance, because that framework helps us to decide what we want to measure and how we are going to measure it. So as an overview, if you want to focus on compliance, what you are measuring is cyber compliance. You're measuring how much your company is compliant with different rules and regulation, existing frameworks. when you're measuring risk directly, what you are measuring is your exposure. And the way to do that, the way to measure exposure, your threat exposure, is by doing a threat assessment. And all three of them, I'm going to deep dive and talk, of course. And the last one, governance, is the ability to measure different processes in the company. And what you're trying to measure is the implementation metrics or the success of the company to actually implement these processes. So let's start with compliance. So like I said, if you want to focus on compliance, if that's what you want to measure, what you are actually measure is your compliance to different laws, regulation, industry standards that are designed to protect sensitive information and cyber attacks. Give me 1 second. Again, sorry about that. And how do you measure it? You need to compare your own posture and everything that you've done to these laws, regulation, and different frameworks. Now, I've put this comics here just to give you a bit of orientation about the current status of cyber frameworks, right? So what we're seeing in the comics situation, there are 14 competing standards. Someone says ridiculous, we need to develop one universal standard that covers all of them. Yeah, and of course, the outcome of that is a new situation where you have 15 competing standards. So even though I think, this is humoristic, I really think it captures pretty good what happened with all of the cybersecurity frameworks. What you can see here at the bottom is just one visualization of all of the different security frameworks and put it on some sort of an axis of how good they are covering, the amount of threats they're covering. It doesn't really matter. The idea is that you have many of these cybersecurity frameworks. I'm sure everyone here has heard about NIST or ISO or CSI, CIS, sorry. But the idea is that you have a lot of them, and you want to measure yourselves against them. Now, if you want to do that, if you want to measure yourselves against all of these frameworks, I think it's quite convenient to say that even though there are many of those, most of them are constructed in a very similar way. Yeah. So what we usually see is that we have in these frameworks groups of security controls. Each group is composed of different maturity level and specific steps that you need to take to actually follow that specific control, to comply with that control. So we're seeing here an example from CIS. So you have, for example, control 17. It breaks down into different implementation steps. Each of the steps is mapped into a, let's call it maturity level. So if I'm just doing 1, 2, 3, I'm in 1. If I'm doing all of them besides the last one and 2, all of them I'm in 3. Now, this is great. And I think, like I said, everyone here is familiar with this, but what are the shortcomings of compliance? What is the problem with just comparing yourself with existing frameworks? First, very big problem is what I call the pseudoscientific. This method of again, comparing yourself with different frameworks seems very quantified. It seems very scientific, especially since it's very number driven, right? So with CIS, I'm compliant, I don't know, 16 out of 18. With NIST, I'm compliant 15 out of 20 with this maturity level and this maturity level. But even though it seems very quantitative, it usually is based very much on assumptions and on very much limited data. And I'll give you an example. Imagine you have a company that has thousands of servers, right? And you want to know if you're compliant with server security. Let's say it's a control in one of the frameworks. How can you really guarantee that all of the configurations and all of the servers are actually good? How do you know that all of the implementations are actually correct and no one changed any of the configurations? So, of course, you can't in most cases. And that's exactly the problem with this approach. So even though we're saying we're in a specific maturity level or we're saying we're covered in one area, it's not necessarily true. And I think this leads to the second point, where there's a strong assumption that compliance reduces risk, right? That if I'll be very good with compliance, it means my risk is reduced. And if you think about it, there is a problem there because all of these frameworks, all of these security frameworks, even though they are very sophisticated, and I have much appreciation to everyone who was involved in developing them, has one big shortcoming, which is they're generic. They're meant to be fit to everyone. And that just can't be true because every company is very unique and has its own unique risk and own uniqueness in general. And I gave this example, just one example, the SVB example, that before what happened to SVB, before everything that happened with the bank, KPMG did an audit. There's a being given the highest score that you can get from them, their audit, which is some sort of a compliance, right? An audit. And yet we all know how this ended. So, just to kind of maybe challenge this assumption between compliance and risk, that maybe you're compliant, but not necessarily means that your risk is lower. Now, governance. Sorry. In the case of governance, what we're trying to measure are different processes, structures, and policies that the organizations is currently doing, right? So how do you measure that? You have different metrics. You have different KPIs. How many incidents or breaches, how much time it takes us to respond to an incident, what is the number of security awareness training sessions we've done, stuff like that. So we were trying to measure if what we're doing was done effectively. Now, the two main shortcomings of that is that, first of all, what I call the unknown unknowns. If you only measure what you plan to do, you're really limited to protect yourself from the next threat or a new type of attack, right? So if I'm now doing only awareness training to ransomware, maybe I'm not doing awareness training to phishing. So I could get a perfect score on the fact that I'm doing all of these trainings, but I'm not training against the new threat. And the second problem with governance is just measuring what we're already doing, is this problem of the connection between output and outcome. When we're measuring output, right, when we're only focusing on what we're doing, we don't really change reality. We want to focus, I have a raised hand, maybe someone has a question, please. I could swear someone raises their hand, but I don't see any questions in the Q&A, so I'm continuing until I see it pop up. So if we're focusing on the output and what we're doing, we're not necessarily focusing on the outcome. So the outcome that we want to do is to lower the risk, right? But we're just focusing on what we're producing and not whether the risk was actually lowered. So again, there's a problem and a lot of shortcomings with just focusing on governance. And the last thing we can measure is the risk itself, right? So when you want to measure risk, so I like the ISO definition of risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty, what might happen, on objectives, what must happen. So we're measuring what can happen to our company while we are trying to achieve our goals. We're measuring what might happen, I don't know, ransomware, when we are trying to grow our company, create new projects, expand our IT structure. So what we want to measure can be done through risk evaluation, where we try to identify the potential risk and threats and assess the likelihood and their potential impact on the organization from everything that we're trying to do. And I think this won't be, this will be familiar to everyone here. The main way to measure risk is doing something like that. We take a risk, we try to give it a likelihood. What is the chances of this risk happening? We try to give it a consequence. If it will happen, will it be low, moderate, high, or extreme? And that's basically it. But also measuring risk will have its shortcomings. Even if I'll go through all of the risks that can happen and give them this specific likelihood and impact scores, it's also not perfect. This could be biased, right? So this is very much dependent on who does the risk evaluation. It could be biased into an individual's opinion. It could just be wrong. And of course, it's not constructive enough. If we know the risk, and if we gave the risk just these scores, I know its likelihood and know its consequence, is it really helping me make decisions? Could I really know what I need to do with it? How do I solve it? How did it change since last time? So this also has its shortcomings. So in the realm of measurement, let's say, I would say the main takeaway is that you should do all. You should measure your compliance, you should measure your governance, and you should measure your risk, right? You should know how good you're compliant to global standards. You should know how well you're doing in your own processes. And of course, you should attend and understand everything that might happen and how risky it really is. Usually people tend to only focus on compliance. And I would say that if I had to choose one, it would be risk. Because at the end of the day, this is what we really care about. So even though it has its shortcomings, I would focus on the one thing we are actually trying to protect ourselves from and actually trying to reduce. All right, so that concludes the first part of the presentation, talking about risk measurement. As a reminder, the next two parts are going to be around probabilistic and deterministic and quantitative and qualitative. But this is a good place to stop and see if anyone has any question. So feel free to raise your hand and write something in the Q&A section. I'll give you a few seconds and I'll drink my tea at the same time. looking at the chat. We have a question. What if there are competing risk scenarios that are related? That is an amazing question. That is an amazing question. And the reason why it's an amazing question is because, like every amazing question, it exactly has to do with what I'm about to talk about. Literally, the next slide is going to be about different risk scenarios that are related to each other. So I'm going to leave that question open, and as I'm going to answer it. All right. Let's give it like 5 more seconds, see if there's anything else. Okay, great. Let's move forward. So we talked about how you measure risks, the different ways to measure it, and what exactly are we measuring. Let's put that aside. I want to talk about now, when you do measure the risk, are you doing it in a deterministic or in a probabilistic way? Now, like I said earlier, you can choose to measure compliance or risk or governance, and you can do it in the deterministic or probabilistic way. It's kind of independent. So, this is really something new. Another thing I'm going to say, maybe a bit of a caveat, this is going to be a bit more technical and a bit more mathy. So, brace yourself. Right. So I gave us an example. I'm going to stick with that example, the risk measurement from the previous section. And I've showed you something very similar to this, right? So I have a risk, and I want to understand for every risk I have in the company, what is the associated probability and consequence. If this risk would to happen, what is the probability of that happening? And if it would happen, how impactful it will be. This is a very deterministic method, going risk by risk and giving it 2 scores, the likelihood and the consequence. But there's a lot of problems with deterministic risk metrics. First of all, it compresses ranges and collapses uncertainty, right? So if I just give everything these 2 numbers, it kind of neglects the fact that I don't really know that in the truth be told is that the likelihood is probably a range and the consequence is probably a range, and it's dependent on variables that I don't really have visibility to. So it's a probabilistic thing. That's one problem. Second problem is exactly related to what was asked in the chat. What if I have 2 risks that are connected to each other, or if you want to say it in a more mathy way, that are correlated? I don't really have that if I have a bunch of risks with likelihood and consequence. Also, it's mathematically impossible to look at all of the risks together, right? If I have 2 risks, one is with consequence 3 and one is with consequence 5, one with likelihood 2 and one with likelihood 4. What is my overall risk? Do I add the consequences? Do I do an average? How do I really tackle that? So all of that could really be solved if I'll move from a deterministic to a probabilistic approach. And in order to show you this process, how it can be done and what are the advantages, I want to use an example, super simplified example, okay? So in this example, I'm in charge of the risk of the company, and I have different projects that I want to do, and I want to give each of the projects a risk level. The risk is between 1 to 10. And the 1 to 10, let's look at it as an abstract number. It could be translated to different things, financial impact, 1 being no financial impact, 10 being crazy, financial catastrophe, maybe outage time, 1 being just minutes, 10 being weeks, could be data leaked, 1 being no data leak, 10 being all my data is leaked. It doesn't really matter. I have all of these different projects, and I gave each of them a risk level. So I have, let's say I want to M&A a new small company. I give it a risk level 5, move to cloud infrastructure, risk level 7, blah, blah, blah. And the average of all of it is 5. So I just took all of the risk, done an average, and I can go to the board and say, hey, our overall, if we'll do all of these projects, our overall risk is 5. So how did I come to this 5? Doing the deterministic method, okay? So in this example, I'm still in the deterministic method. What I've probably done is I took the project, M&A of a new small company, each of these lines, yeah? So I thought, what are the risks involved in buying a new company? New data leak can happen, and we can have malware on the new laptops, and the employees can have, they can open a phishing email, okay? Each of these risks, I gave a likelihood and an impact. I kind of multiplied the 2 to get the exposure, got to an average of 5, and that's the 5 that you're seeing here. Okay, this is a standard, deterministic, simplified process of a project. But if I want to move to a probabilistic method, it's not very hard. The only thing I need to do as a first step is understand and contain the fact that there is uncertainty related to each of these risks, right? So I'm still in the example of the M&A of a new small company and the risks related. And now what I want to do is, instead of just give a likelihood and an impact to each of them, I want to break down the impact into 3 scores: low, most likely, and maximum. So given that I don't really know what will be the impact of data leak of new data, because I don't really know how much data is going to be leaked, I'm going to give it a range with the most likely, let's say, somewhere in the middle. So the first thing that I've done is translated the impacts, or better to say, broaden the impacts into a range. Now, just doing this very simplified thing can allow me to now use what is called a Monte Carlo simulation. So I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Monte Carlo simulation. I'm assuming some are and some are not. So what I'll do is just give a pretty quick overview of what it is. A Monte Carlo simulation, at the end of the day, is very simple. All I do is simulate, okay? I simulate the simulation many times, right? So what I try to do is to take a scenario that I'm not certain about, but I have data about what can happen in a different range, and just run it through a simulation, let's say 10,000 times. Okay, so let's say I'm only looking at data leak of new data, and I'm running this through a Monte Carlo simulation. So what I'm trying to assess in the simulation is how much impact I will actually have, what will be the actual impact from data leak of new data. Given this range, what will happen in the simulation is that in every one of the 10,000 simulation, I'm going to sample an impact from this range, right? So let's say that this range kind of dictates a distribution. So the way that simulation works, and just by the law of big numbers, what will happen is that in many cases, the number I'm going to draw from the distribution is going to be quite low. In most cases, it's going to be around the most likely, the mean. But in some cases, it's going to be low, and in some cases, it's going to be the max. And we can expect some sort of a Gaussian, let's say, or a bell-shaped distribution out of the result of this, right? Because again, most of the time it's going to be the middle, but sometimes it's going to be more around the edges. Now, once I've done that, what I'm able to do is now change the way that I look at the risk. And I don't only give it one number, I actually can show you a full distribution of all of the impacts and what are their probabilities. So now I can say that for this risk, the probability of actually having an exposure of 6 or 5 is 0.41. Now, I can do this not only for this risk, but I can do this for all of the risks together. And this is exactly where the question that was asked in the Q&A comes into play. So if I run the simulation on all of the risks at the same time, I can understand my overall risk and what is the probability of experiencing different impacts. So now what I can do is shift from a world where I show the exposures and the risks in a deterministic way into a world where I can communicate what are the different probabilities to experience the different range of impacts. So I can say, for example, that there's a 40% probability that the exposure will be higher than 5, right? Which is the original estimate of the overall exposure. But I can say at the same token that there's a 25% probability that the exposure will be higher than 7. And there's even a 5% probability that the exposure will be higher than 9. Now, once you can get this full range, you and your stakeholders in the company can make more informed decisions. Because if for us, impact of 9 is no-go under any circumstance, and 5% probability is just not acceptable, maybe we won't go with the project. Maybe it's okay. Every company has their own risk appetite. And by doing a probabilistic method and understanding the full breadth of the risk and everything that can happen, you can adjust what you're doing to your own risk appetite. And again, if it wasn't clear, you can run the Monte Carlo simulation and all of the risks at the same time and see the correlations between them, and then get an overall understanding of the risk in these terms. So again, that was a bit mathy. I'll stop here again for Q&A. Let's see if there are any questions. I'll give it a few seconds before I move to the third and final part. All right, just 10 more seconds. Well, I don't want to pressure you, but oh, yeah, I was just about to move forward. How did you get the percentage, the math? Great question. Okay, I think the question is, how did I get to these percentages? All right, so let me explain. When you do the Monte Carlo simulation, so what you do, as I said, you simulate what will happen 10,000 times. In some cases, nothing will happen. In some cases, something very bad will happen. In some cases, something pretty moderate is going to happen. Okay, now look at this 10,000s simulation as our, as the group of outcomes that can come. Once I have that, what I can do is I can count in how many of the cases out of the 10,000 each of the impacts actually happened. So for example, in how many of the simulated 10,000 did the impact exceed 2? It says 0.2 here, but let's call it 2. And how many of the cases did it exceed 6? So let's say that out of the 10,000 and 5,000, it exceeded 5. This means that if I will play out what can happen next year, let's say 10,000 times, 5 out of 10, what we'll see is that the outcome is higher than 5. And this can easily be translated into a 50%, right? So the idea is that when you simulate something many, many times, you can ask yourselves, in how many of the 10,000 simulations did something really bad happen? Let's say a 9 happened. And I can say only in 5% out of the 10,000 simulations, the result exceeded 9. So this is the way that I can translate the results of the simulation into actual percentages. Okay, so it's like saying, I don't know what's going to happen. I ran a simulation. Most of it was okay, but in 5% of the simulation, something horrific happened. So this means that there's a 5% chance that something bad will happen if we onboard this risk. I hope that answers the question. If not, again, feel free on the Q&A. These intermediate Q&A are great, but you can always send them. Okay, the last part I want to talk about is qualitative versus quantitative. So what's the difference between qualitative and quantitative? So quantitative is when we do risk assessment that involves any mathematical models and statistical analysis to quantify the likelihood of the potential impacts. While qualitative is when we do risk assessment that only uses expert judgment and subjective evaluation to assess the risk. So let's go back to our known and famous example and beloved example of this chart. So again, we're talking now about something different from the probabilistic and deterministic, different from the measurement. So I'm just going to look at this chart and use it as an example. So my question is, how did I come up with the numbers in this chart? Okay, and this is a great example to show how it doesn't matter if you do a probabilistic or deterministic, because even if you came with a range, or even if you came with one number, probabilistic versus deterministic, you still need to come with numbers. How did you come with these numbers? I have a risk. How can I say it's a 3 on likelihood, it's a 2 on consequence? How is this process happening? So one way is to do it in a qualitative, which is assemble some people in a room, all sit together, some cyber experts, and just go one by one and give it a likelihood and consequence from experience, from data, from everything that everyone knows. And we do this once a year. We assess the risk. We can move on. We can throw it into Monte Carlo simulation. Advantages: it's fast, it's easy, straightforward. The only domain expert you need for a qualitative assessment is just cyber. Disadvantages is that it's very, very much biased, right? So if this committee of people or this one person that does that has the wrong idea, not from a malicious intent, of course, just, from personal experience and personal bias, just gives the wrong likelihood or the wrong consequence. It could have a lot of consequences. Another problem is that this is not transferable to mitigation plan, right? It's hard to compare if an investment, if I'll tell you that we have a risk with a 5 likelihood and a 4 consequence, is it worth investing $10 million to mitigate this risk or to avoid this risk? It's hard to say. Depends on so many stuff, on the revenue, on everything, right? So it's very hard to transfer this into mitigation plan. And also, it's hard to communicate. So as a CISO, if you go to the board and say, we have a risk, it's likelihood 3, it's consequence 4, we need to mitigate it, you could hear something like, why? It's fine, it's only likelihood 3. Only consequence 4, it's not 5. We don't need to mitigate it. So it's very hard. It's not a language of risk, talking in qualitative measures. Quantitative, on the other hand, is when you give a dollar value into each of the risks. When you actually say, this risk can cost us this amount of money. Now, talking about financial quantification, of course, the main disadvantages of doing financial quantification is that it requires data. You can't just out of the blue come up with different financial impacts to your risks. It requires trust because there's some sort of a method that needs to be done to translate the risks into the quantitative measures. And you need to know how to do it or use a tool. And this is the point where, it's important for me to mention that Cover, where I work at, where I've been working for the past 6 years, this is exactly what we do. What we do is translating cyber risk into financially quantified measures. So, for the sake of the, let's call it just the easiness of it, I'm going to use screenshots from our own platform just to show you how a financially quantified risk looks like and what are the advantages. So first of all, when you financially quantify the risk, when you don't do a qualitative measurement, you can better communicate the risk. If you're able to show something like this and say, hey, our average risk from cyber exposure is around 10 million. Worst case scenario, it could be 90 million, but best case scenario, it could be just a little shy under 300,000. It's very different from the 3 and 5 that I mentioned earlier. Not only that, it's much easier to measure over time, right? So if I look at the average as an example and measure how it develops over time, I can show how our different processes, how our different investments actually reduce the risks from each assessment that was done. So that's one. Of course, you can always, if you do this financially quantified assessment, you can show, like we talked about with the probabilistic, a full distribution of everything that can happen and what is the probability of that happening, right? So what we do at Cover, we combine the probabilistic approach with the financially quantified approach to create this full distribution. So you can say the probability of losing 20 million next year is around 20%, but 90 billion is around 1%. Again, easier to communicate, easier to adjust your cyber risk, your risk appetite accordingly. Another thing you can do when you quantify the risk is make smarter decisions around security investments. So what we're seeing here, as an example, is a demo company, and this is a security framework like we've seen at the beginning. This is CIS, and this company, as an example, asks for these 3 controls at implementation level. So like we talked in the beginning, this company decided to measure not only the risk, but also their compliance. And this is how well they're doing on these 3 controls. So one interesting question that should be asked is, what will be the impact of maturing these 3 controls? And when you have quantified your risk, what you can do, you can also answer that question in quantified measurement. So if I'll take this CIS control and move it from maturity level 2 to 3, this is how much I'll be reducing from the risk. And if I know how much this maturing process is going to cost me, let's say it's 20,000, I can also calculate the ROI. I have a question. Great. Are all quantitative metrics based on single assumption that a financial loss event will occur? Or are there other outcomes you would measure? Opportunity loss, reputation impact, etc. This is a great question. Most definitely, one of the things that you need to do when you look into a quantified tool or a quantified approach, you need to ask yourself, what exactly are we measuring? So, I don't want to talk too much about Cover because I want to keep this, also, I don't think I have a good example of it. I want to keep this lecture a bit more broad, but maybe the best question, Gary, it's great that you raised this, that you need to ask yourself is, for financial quantification, what exactly is included in the financial outcome? So you need to take into account everything that can happen, all the tangible outcomes that can happen. That includes lost income, that can include regulation fines, that can include PR loss, reputation loss, loss of clients. And part of the process, also part of what we do at Cover, is just coming up with a framework that will capture everything that can happen. And there are many more examples, right? Data recovery, notification costs, but this is the key element from the quantification process. You need to take this somewhat obscure or abstract concept of cyber event, and you have to break it down into what will actually cost you money, what I'm going to spend money on, where I'm going to lose money, what are the cost components of the event. So whether you choose to use a third-party tool or to do financial quantification yourself, this is a process you will have to go through. Thank you, Gary, for mentioning this. And the last thing I want to mention, how you can use financial quantification. So I talked about communication and a better investment and calculating of ROI. One more thing is cyber insurance. So given that cyber insurance is something that is very much, is very financial, the terms and conditions are very, very financial, you can compare your cyber insurance terms and conditions to your quantified exposure and understand, am I overcovered? Am I undercovered? Is there maybe a specific coverage that I don't need because I'm currently, the limit is way higher than what I can actually lose? Maybe the deductible is higher than what I can actually lose. So only by comparing your terms and conditions of your cyber insurance to your quantified risk, you can really understand how well you're covered, right? So what we're seeing here as an example is the full quantification of the company. If the terms and conditions of the cyber policy are projected on the quantification, so the gray is the deductible, the red is the limit. So you can understand that dark purple is where the company is actually covered, and the light purple is where they're not covered. You can make all sorts of decisions off of it. This is something that I've been seeing as very, very useful, especially given how crazy the cyber insurance market has been for the past year or two. Right, so just to conclude everything that we talked about the dimension of deterministic versus probabilistic. And I would say that a conclusion that could be from this lecture is that probabilistic would be better, looking at the full breadth of the risk, understanding all the uncertainty, understanding the relation between the different risks, like what was asked in the Q&A, is key in risk management. If you think about risk versus compliance, I would say you want to be more risk focused, you want to do risk assessment, but I put this gray circle here to also say, keep an eye on compliance. It's never bad to also compare yourself to more, global standards and to know where you are. But if you had to choose one, you should focus on risk. And if you're thinking about qualitative versus quantitative, you should focus on quantitative, given that only financial measurement can help you communicate the risk to stakeholders, to board. It can help you understand the ROI, can help you understand where you want to invest. Will this investment actually reduce the risk? Or is just investing because it's a risk I heard in the news, or a risk that someone told me I should protect myself from? And of course, it can help you with your cyber insurance if you have one. So if you want to go with the quantitative approach, so there are many ways to do that, and there are many tools. There are ways you can do it by yourself. If anyone is interested in that, I'll be happy to also talk after this lecture. Feel free to reach out. Feel free, by email or LinkedIn or whatever you prefer. I'll be happy to answer a question around quantitative, but in general. So that concludes today's lecture. I do want to leave some time. We have 13 minutes. If anyone has any other question, I'll be super happy to answer. And so, yeah, I'll give you a minute or two to see if there are any questions in the Q&A. We'll take some more tea at the same time. Right, give it 10 more seconds. Maybe someone is typing a really long question. Question. Do you get 2 questions? Okay. Do you get asked to expand outside of risk? That's a great question. I think that, there are definitely correlations between cyber risk, and other types of risks. From what I'm seeing from the super high majority of companies that I've been talking to, usually it's pretty siloed. So usually when someone is looking into cyber risk management, it's only focused on cyber risk. Personally, I do see correlations to other risks, but I don't think, let's say, the market is at maturity level to really look at these correlations. I think most of the companies are currently not even doing this, which is maybe even quite basic stuff around cyber risk management alone. So I would say, we should focus on this as a market, as an industry, before talking about expanding to correlations to other risks. But I will say that everything that we talked about could be also applied to every other type of risk, right? Deterministic, probabilistic, compliance versus risk, quantitative, qualitative. It's not something that will only work for cyber. It will definitely work for any type of risk. And this is the right way to do risk management, regardless of the type of risk. Okay, that was one question. And the second one was, does this platform offer an outline on creating an enterprise risk management framework? And basically the platform, what this does is creating a risk management framework. It's not even an outline. It helps you, understand all of your risks, quantify all of the risks to all of the parts of the company or the company as a whole. It can help you understand what mitigation plans you need to take, what maybe insurance steps you need to take. So if I had to give it a name, I would call it an enterprise risk management platform. So not even an outline. So the short answer is yes. All right. So marking these two as answered. And I'll give it a few more seconds to see if there are any other questions. I'll just say again that if you do have a question that you haven't asked in the chat, or maybe you don't feel comfortable to ask in the chat, or maybe you thought about it only tomorrow, please, 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 I really ask you, everyone, reach out, LinkedIn, email, whatever you want. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions, or just talk about any of this in general. If you wanna, this is something that I'm excited about, I'm happy to talk about, always open for conversation around risk management. All right, so I don't see any other questions. Okay, so I'll stop the share. Great, so thank you, everyone. And just one more thing I want to say, given we had a bit of questions about the platform that we haven't covered,